Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at day 2 of the Tata Steel Chess India Rapid and Blitz event. Now, on day number 1, the 5-time world champion Magnus Carlsen had a little bit of a sluggish start. He had 2 draws and 1 win, perhaps a little bit lucky to even win 1 game. So with all these sluggish games at the start, Magnus definitely hoping for a big bounce back on day number 2. So let's pick it up in round 4, or the first game of the day, and Magnus has the black pieces against SL Narayanan from India. Now, SL Narayanan is a very strong Indian player. He's in the 2nd tier, right around 2700. Hasn't quite broken through to join the ranks of Prag, Gukesh, and Arjun, but nonetheless a very talented player. All right, let's jump right into the action. Magnus with the black pieces, and the game starts out with the move e4. Magnus plays e5, we get knight to f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and now we have a6 and bishop a4. Now, thus far, pretty standard. This, of course, is what is known as the Ruy Lopez, or the Spanish opening. It has been in existence for nearly 600 years at this point. We get knight to f6, castles, bishop to e7, and now we get the move queen to e2. After queen to e2, we get d6, and we have the move c3. Magnus castles, we get rook to d1, bishop d7, and now we have the move bishop b3. Magnus goes knight to a5, trying to attack the bishop on this long diagonal, and Narayanan retreats it to c2. Magnus plays c5, we get d4, and now we have the move queen c7. Now, this position is a little bit unusual from the standpoint that white's setup is a little bit different than what we normally expect. Normally, when black goes for these knight a5, c5, b5 ideas, usually it occurs with a position after castles, bishop e7, rook to e1, b5, bishop b3, castles, h3, d6, c3, knight to a5, bishop c2, c5, d4, queen c7. Now, you'll notice here the difference is that white has played h3 to stop bishop g4, and white also has the rook on e1 versus having the queen on e2. Nonetheless, it is pretty similar. So back to the game, we get this position with queen c7. Here, d5 is played by Narayanan, and now Magnus goes for b5, trying to potentially push the pawns to b4, c4, but most importantly, creating a square for the knight to drop back to, in the case of white ever playing b4 down the road. So we get b3, Magnus plays g6, we get knight bd2, and now we have the move knight b7. Narayanan plays knight to f1, and Magnus plays knight to h5. Now, what Magnus is hoping to do here is he wants to start playing on the king side, pushing f5 potentially, but he needs to be aggressive here. The queen side is temporarily closed. You'll notice that there are no open files here on this side of the board. So if Magnus can play f5 and start attacking on the king side, he will have chances to get a big initiative. So we get bishop h6. Magnus goes knight g7, fianchettoing the knight. Now, this is a little bit of an unusual situation. Very rarely does black want a knight on g7 versus a bishop, but in this case, as we're about to see, the knight on g7 is very optimally placed. Black wants to play for f5, but more importantly, we're going to see that there's a way to go after this bishop on h6. So we get knight g3. Magnus plays f6, we get a4, and now we have the move rook f b8. Here, Narayanan takes on b5, we get takes, and now we have the move bishop d3, and Magnus plays queen b6, guarding the pawn on b5. Narayanan plays b4, and this is really the start of going in a wrong direction. Now, the computer here wants white to play h4, trying to push p on the king side. A little bit aggressive here, and frankly, a little bit unnatural as well, because after knight to d8, black has 2 ideas. First idea is, let's just say you go king h1, there's knight to f7, attacking the bishop on h6, and suddenly these knights are very well placed. If white moves the bishop back, you can maybe play f5 here, trying to open up the center of the board, or attack on the king side here. Additionally, you can also play bishop g4, pinning the knight on f3. Now, one of the basic things we learn in chess at a very young age is that allowing pins like this really it's not a good thing. That's why pushing this pawn to h4 doesn't really make a lot of sense on the one hand, but it also shows why computers are so strong, because after knight to d8, if white goes h5 here, knight to f7, bishop to e3, and bishop g4, the computer thinks that after takes, and queen d2, with this open h file, or is it queen d2? Sorry, queen c2, I should say. White is maybe a little bit better, because after something like queen d8 and bishop e2 here, you break the pin, or maybe it's not even bishop e2. Honestly, you can tell that I have not taken a super close look at this game ahead of time, but it shows how difficult it is, because my human perspective is actually quite wrong. At any rate, Narayanan plays move b4, we get c4, bishop c2, and now we have the move knight d8 with the idea of going knight f7 and kicking this bishop out of the h6 square. Narayan plays knight d2, and now Magnus goes queen b7. And the reason the computer thinks that black is better here is now there is one open file. This A file, it is the only open file on the board here, and black is fighting for it, whereas white is never really attacking on the king side anymore. So Narayan plays bishop e3. We get rook takes rook, rook takes, rook to a8, and now we have the move rook f1 being played. Now this move is a mistake according to the computer, but it's a move that I completely understand, because after queen to d1 here, let's just say knight to f7. Say white plays f3, for example. You can go f5, bishop f2, f4, knight e2. And now in this position, I think black can start going g5, h5, g4, attacking as though this is a king's Indian. And because white still has no play on the king's, or the queen side, I should say here, and black controls the open file, black is in great shape and should win the game. So Narayan goes rook f1. Very understandable decision. He wants to play f4. He wants to be tactical here. He's playing against Magnus Carlsen, who's considered to be the greatest positional player of all time. And he just figures, you know what? Let's throw all caution to the wind and go for the kill. Magnus plays rook to a3, attacking the pawn on c3. We get f4 here, and now Magnus plays knight f7. Now it's interesting that the computer here actually prefers to move knight to f7, f4, and rook to a2 rather than rook a3. I think when Magnus played rook to a3, he simply missed that if he were to take the pawn, there's knight to b1, and suddenly the rook on c3 is trapped. If you go to a3, I capture. If you go to either of these squares, I capture the rook. If you take, I take. If you take, I take. You sack the rook, but in return, white has a rook for a bishop. And due to the very closed nature of the pawn structure here and very few open files, white is a little bit better. So we get knight f7, and here Narayan plays f takes e5, and this is actually a mistake. Computer wants to move f5 here, trying to attack on the f file, and after a move like bishop to d8, white can still play king to h1 here, because if rook c3, knight b1 traps the rook again, and after black plays something like, I guess, g takes f5, e takes f5, takes knight e4, very imbalanced position here. I guess black is maybe a little bit better here. He sacked the rook and he has a bishop and a couple of pawns, but the position is incredibly messy and very complex. So it's not easy to figure out what's going on here, but Narayan plays pawn takes pawn. Of course, this is a rapid game, so mistakes are bound to happen. So Magnus takes with the d pawn here. Narayan plays knight b1. We get rook to a2, pinning the bishop on c2, and now we have the move h3. Here Magnus plays the move knight to e8, and this move is a good move. It's not the absolute best move. Computer prefers f5, trying to attack immediately, but from my standpoint, knight e8 is a very logical move because Magnus knows he's better here. He knows that he can blockade this pawn, keep the pressure alive, and as long as he doesn't blunder something in the long term, he can keep waiting, keep pressing on the clock, keep improving his position, and good things will happen. Whereas if you were to play a move like f5 here, you'll notice that Narayan still has 8 minutes on the clock. So if Narayan can find a tactical blow here, spend 2-3 minutes and find something, it could all go wrong for Magnus. So we get the move knight to e8. Narayan plays bishop c5. We get knight e to d6 here, and now we have the move king h2. Here Magnus plays queen to a8. You'll notice again, computer still screaming from f5, screaming for f5, but queen to a8 is very logical. As you guard the rook on a8, you can play f5, king g7. You can keep improving the position here, and in many cases, if you keep improving the position, your opponent keeps using more time, it is a lot easier to play. So we get rook f2. Magnus plays queen to d8, and now we get to move queen to d1, rook on f2, guarding the bishop on c2, and white potentially can go for queen f1 down the road to attack on the f file. Magnus plays bishop f8, we get bishop to e3, and now we have the move bishop h6. Now what Magnus is trying to do is when you look at this position conceptually, you'll notice that the dark square b is a little bit passive here. The pawns are in the way, can't really activate it. So he wants to get rid of this bishop, and then he's going to argue, let's just say white were to take, like in the game. Now white is saddled with a very bad bishop on c2. It's very passive, not really doing anything here, no diagonals, no scope whatsoever. So white has a terrible bishop, and now black is positionally winning. So we get knight d2. Magnus plays king g7, guarding the pawn on f6, and now we have the move knight df1. Here Magnus plays knight f7, we get queen to f3, and now we have the move rook a3, trying to go after the pawn on c3 once again, and the queen on d8, of course, guards the pawn on f6. So we get queen e3. Magnus plays queen a8, we get queen f3, and now we get the move knight to e8, guarding the pawn on f6. Narayan plays knight e2, we get queen to a7 here, trying to target the rook on f2. Knight e3 is played, and now we get to move knight g5. Now knight e3 is a move that does effectively lose the game on the spot, but frankly Magnus is going to win the game anyway here. Because if you play something like queen g3, which is one of the top moves, after knight ed6 here, or sorry, not knight ed6, what is the move? After rook to a1 here, you attack the knight on f1. White's pieces are a little bit passive here. You'll notice the knight on e2, also not a great piece. Neither of these squares can be used by the horse. So with the rook infiltrating on the a file, the queen coming down as well, and the weak pawn on e4 in the long run, this should be winning. A sample line is knight to e3, rook to e1, going after these knights, bishop d1, and now after knight g5, you attack the pawn on e4. If white goes bishop c2, now you have queen to a1, going for the checkmate, and white is just getting crushed in every way here. So Narianon plays knight e3, Magnus goes knight g5, we get queen g3, and now after knight to d6, suddenly white's position is collapsing. You're really struggling to guard the pawn on e4. Pawn on c3 is a little bit weak. Knight on e3 and the rook on f2 are also under pressure. With all these weaknesses in the position, white is simply in a ton of trouble. So Narianon plays the move knight to f4, knight to f4 here, and this move is simply a desperation move. It doesn't really matter what you do here. Computer wants rook to f3, which frankly is a little bit insane, because after takes, you're simply down a rook for a knight. You're gonna lose anyway, so that doesn't really do much. Knight f4 is a desperation move, trying to bring the knight in, go for some counterplay, and here Magnus plays rook takes c3, and Narianon resigns the game immediately. Now, if Magnus were to take the free horse on f4 after takes, knight e8 and e5, there's suddenly a lot of pressure here. The pawn on f6 is weak, the knight on g5 is weak, white is attacking on the f file, and even though black has an extra bishop here, with these pawns in the center and the weak black king here, everything is up in the air, and who knows what will happen. But after rook takes c3, now white is still in tons of trouble, because the pawn on e4 is weak, the knight on e3 is weak, the knight on f4 is hanging, and all of white's pieces are just completely misplaced here, and black is going to win the game. So Narianon resigns this game. With that, Magnus starts off with a resounding victory in the first game on the second day of the Tata Still Rapid and Blitz event, and let's see if he can keep the streak going with the second game of the day, where he has white pieces against the famous American player Wesley So. Now, Wesley is someone who I've played against many times, one of my compatriots. He hasn't been as active this year as in past years, but he still remains a very formidable opponent. So Magnus has the white pieces, and he opens with the move e4. We get e5, knight f3, and here Wesley plays the move knight to f6, essaying the classic Petrov's defense. Magnus takes, and here we get the move knight takes e4. Now, this is what is known as a Damiano variation within the Petrov. The famous streamer Hikaru Nakamura really resurrected this line during the Chess Champions Tour final in December of 2023, when he played against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, as well as Magnus Carlsen, and I believe maybe even Norbek Abdus-Torah. So Wesley here thinks he's Hikaru, bro thinks he's Hikaru, as the meme would go with this knight takes e4. Now, Wesley also did play this in the recent US Chess Championship against none other than the future first American World Chess Champion, Hans Niemann. It was a game that would be a pretty boring draw. So you get queen e2. Wesley goes queen to e7 here. Again, if you were to move the knight, there's knight c6 here, creating the classic I was about to say bastion, but the classic fossil here, where you check the king and you attack the queen. If you block, you lose the queen. You block, you lose the queen. Either way, you're losing your queen. You're at a huge material deficit, and you will lose the game. So we get queen e7, takes, d6 is played here, attacking the knight, and now we have the move d4. If white moves the knight, white loses the queen here, and it's game over as well. So we get d4, takes, knight to c6, and now Magnus plays the move knight c3. Wesley takes, we get the trade, and we have this move bishop f4, f6, and castles, and bishop d7. Now, one thing I would highlight about certain opening systems and certain players is I do believe that this system can be very effective with black when you're trying to make a draw. But when I was originally looking at the system, I did think to myself, and when I was talking to my trainer as well, we more or less concluded that this line, we felt that I could probably draw this against almost anybody in the world not named Magnus Carlsen. And what is the reason for that? It's not really so much psychological as much as it is that Magnus just has this very otherworldly, unique positional feel for positions, in a way that nobody else has. And he just has this way of finding the best moves, keeping the pressure up. And both my second Chris and I, we concluded that against anybody not named Magnus, we thought that I could probably draw with the system, but against Magnus, I did not really feel very good about going into this endgame. So those are my general feelings about playing this against Magnus, but Wesley feels differently. So let's see if he can actually draw this position. So Magnus plays knight b5, and here we get the move castles, takes, king b8, and here we have the move knight b5. Wesley goes bishop c5. Black is temporarily down a pawn, but you have a lot of activity very quickly, and white's bishop and rook are not developed in this position. So we get the move f3 here from Magnus. Wesley plays the move g5. We get takes, and now we have the move knight c3. Now white is up a pawn here, but the argument for black is that with the bishop combo here and potentially some open files, black should be able to draw the game. So Wesley goes g4. Magnus takes, we get bishop to e3, king b1, and now we have bishop c6 being played. Now the computer actually says this is the top line. You'll notice the players are using relatively little time at this point, which tells me that both players were probably still in preparation and had already looked at this position. So we get rook, takes, and now we get to move bishop d3, Wesley takes, and here we get to move rook e1. Wesley plays bishop to f4, and now we get this move h4 being played. Now it's interesting to note that as I look at the actual computer evaluation here, it's basically saying that bishop c6 is probably a little bit inaccurate. Black should probably take on g4 here, and after takes bishop d3 and h5. White remains up this extra a pawn, but black has decent chances to draw the game. So back to the game, we got bishop f4, and here Magnus plays h4, which is a slight mistake. Computer prefers to move rook to g1 instead, but Magnus plays h4. Here we get to move h6, avoiding hanging the pawn on h7, but also trying to stop white from pushing g5. Magnus plays rook g1, and now we get to move bishop to f3, and this is an epic blunder, which effectively loses the game for Wesley. So now it's not obvious why bishop f3 isn't okay, but the computer wants bishop to c6 here, because if white goes g5, after takes bishop to e3, suddenly the rook is under a lot of pressure here. If you go to g3, I just keep tickling the rook forever. And if you go to g4, after rook g4, now there's bishop d7, rook g1, bishop e3, and we end up in this very weird situation where white can't really keep the rook on the g file to guard the pawn. If you go here, I just keep tickling the rook between these two squares, and now I keep tickling between these two squares. So eventually white's gonna have to play a position like this, for example, but with white only having one extra a pawn on the board here, this should be a draw. But Wesley plays bishop f3, and now after g5, black is simply lost, because when you take, if you go bishop to e3 here, now I have rook to g3, and suddenly both your bishops are under attack, and after rook f8, I go g6, g7, and white is completely winning the game. You'll have to give up one of the bishops, and you will lose. So after takes, Wesley tries the e4, desperately trying to create some counterplay. He needs to get this g pawn off the board, because if this pawn gets up to g6 or g7 with the rook behind it, white will win. So Magnus takes. Wesley trades, and now he goes bishop to e3, and here Magnus plays rook f1. Now after rook to f1, the game is effectively over, because now white is up not one but two pawns here, and white is not going to lose this g pawn here, so the rest is simply basic technique. Wesley plays rook e8, and here Magnus goes g6, another great move, sacking the horse on e4. But if black takes the horse, you go g7. If rook e8, there's rook to f8, pawn guards the rook, white gets a queen and wins the game. And if you go rook g4, I still play check, king moves, I make the queen, and very regrettably, you do not have rook g1, creating the back rank checkmate here, because white will sack the queen, push the pawn, or move the rook, let's just say, put something on all the light squares here. And now white has a rook and a pawn for the bishop, and white will win as well. So after g6, Wesley plays the move bishop to h6. We get to move knight to c5 here. We have rook to g8, and now Magnus plays rook g1. Here we get to move king to c8. Worth pointing out that you might think on first glance there's bishop to e3 attacking the knight and the rook at the same time, which it does, but after knight to d7 check, king to c8, and knight to f6 here, rook g7 and rook g2, white still guards the pawn. You'll move the knight and start pushing the p up the board once again and win in short order. So after rook g1, we get king to c8. Here Magnus plays the move rook to g4. Nice move, avoiding any threats on the dark squares here. Rook still guards the pawn as well. Wesley plays b6. We get knight to e4 here, and now we have the move bishop g7. Magnus goes c3. We get king d7, and now we have knight g3 with the idea of either knight to f5 or knight to h5. Wesley plays rook h8. We get knight to f5, bishop f6, g7, rook g8, and here Magnus plays the move rook to e4, cutting off the black king from coming to the e file. And this position Wesley resigns simply because with the king unable to come to e6, let's just say, just to set up a sample position, if the king gets to e6, suddenly the pawn on g7 is loose, knight on f5 is loose, and black is very much in the game. But here the rook cuts off the king. The king cannot get to the e file here, and if black ever takes the pawn, now there's rook g4 pinning the bishop here. If you move the bishop, you lose the rook. If you go king e6, I simply take the bishop, and after trade, you're down a horse, and if you move, I check, and just something like a3 here, followed by king a2, and with a knight and a pawn extra in this position, white will also win in short order. So Wesley's position is just hopeless. Even if you play rook a8, I can just go a3 here, for example, just keep improving the position, and black is paralyzed and can't do anything. So a huge win for Magnus in the second game of the day, the 5th round of the tournament. He's now on a heater with 3 consecutive wins. Sorry, he won the last game on day 1. So he's now has 3 consecutive wins. He's heating up, and let's take a look at the final game of the day. Now, one other thought I wanted to add is that looking at that last game, you heard my thoughts about who I thought I could play this against. This really does highlight the uniqueness of how great Magnus Carlsen is, because if I feel like I could play that Damiano against anybody not named Magnus in the world, it just shows how great Magnus's positional understanding and technique in the end game is. But it also shows how well I understand this, because when Wesley tried to do it, he did lose to Magnus in this line. All right, so final game of the day, Magnus on a 3-game heater. He's beat Vidit, Narinon, and of course Wesley So, and now he's playing against the madman himself, the man who has been on absolute fire in recent times, the Indian Grandmaster Arjun Erigaisi, who recently competed in the Chennai Grand Masters. Now, Arjun temporarily got his rating up to about 28-10. There was a lot of talk about how he might overtake Magnus, become the world #1 player in the near future. Aravind had some thoughts about that. He beat Arjun. Arjun would draw, I believe, in the final game as well, to end up at 28-01 and back to #4 in the world. But he is the player who all eyes have been on, and this is a very big matchup. So let's see if Arjun can show Magnus who the new boss is going to be. All right, so Magnus is a black piece, obviously on a 3-game heater. We're going to continue looking from Magnus' point of view. Let's see if he can make it 4 wins in a row. So Arjun opens with e4. Magnus plays c5. We get knight to f3, and now we have the move e6, and this is pretty standard Sicilian variation here. After d4 takes, Magnus has 2 options. He can play knight to c6, like in the game. This is what is known as the Taimanov or the Paulson variation, or playing a6, which is known as the Kahn variation. Now, in the recent Global Chess League, Magnus did play a6 against Alireza Firouzja. He would win a very, very shaky game against Alireza. This system is considered to be a little bit dubious, and Magnus instead decides to play knight c6, perhaps showing a little bit more respect towards Arjun. We get the move knight c3. Magnus plays queen c7. We get bishop to e3, and here we have the move a6, stopping white from ever moving a knight to b5 or the d5 square here. We get the move a3, trying to stop black from playing bishop b4 to pin the knight, and now Magnus trades the knights, and he goes b5, intending to develop the bishop to b7 and trying to attack on the diagonal right away. Here we get to move bishop to e2. Magnus plays bishop to b7, and now we get to move castles to the queen side. Now, this move is interesting. Computer actually prefers if white were to castle to the king side, but one thing that I love about Arjun's games is he is not afraid of complications. He does not sense danger. He just wants to go all in for the kill. And when you castle to the queen side, this is very aggressive because you're castling into an open c file here where black can create the double stack, which happens in the game. But on top of that, black is going to try to go b4 a5. White is going to try to push the pawns on the king side, and this is going to be a decisive game. Now, showing a lack of fear of Magnus is definitely something to be there's something to be said about that. The less fear you show for Magnus, or the less respect you have, the better your chances generally are, because a lot of players have a little bit too much respect. Not necessarily speaking for myself, although at times that has been true, but when you have too much respect, you start playing slightly suboptimal moves. You start trying to hold the game a little bit more, not take risks, and that is not how you want to play. And so it's great to see that Arjun here just showing no fear and going for the kill, just like he does in every other game that he plays. So we get the move king b1. Magnus plays knight to f6, trying to put pressure on the pawn on e4 here, and now Arjun plays the move e5. Now, the computer here already is saying that white has to be very careful to not end up worse. The best move is bishop to f3, which looks a little bit weird to me, frankly, because normally you want to push the f pawn here. You'll play f4, f3. f3 supports g4, g5, for example, or go f4 followed by e5, or say a position like this, where now you can push the pawns and the bishop is behind both bishops are behind the 2 pawns. Now, the reason bishop f3 looks weird is, again, it's very unusual. Normally, you want the pawn on f4. And frankly, as I look at the computer line here, it wants e5, queen d3, b4, takes. And I guess after knight a4, white is okay here. But the fact that you're not playing the center of the board, black has an open c file, maybe an open b file. Honestly, this looks a little bit weird to me. And I think that it'd be very easy to lose control here with the white side if you're not a 3500 level stonkfish. So we get to move e5. Here, knight d5 is played by Magnus, and now Arjun trades the knights on d5, and here we get to move bishop d3, trying to guard the pawn on c2 from being captured. But now Magnus can play bishop g2, winning a pawn on g2, and after rook g1 and bishop d5, black is simply up a pawn here in the center of the board, and now everything is going to come down to whether Magnus can complete his development, because if he can get, let's just say, 5 moves here just to set it up, something like this, black will win the game. You've castled the king, developed the bishop, you can play f6 or d6, and the extra pawn is going to make a huge difference. If, on the other hand, you're unable to complete your development, white could create initiative, start attacking, and win the game. So here Arjun goes to h4, Magnus plays g6, and now we get this move queen to f4, bishop to e7 is played, and here we have the move h5. Now you'll notice Magnus has developed the bishop, but he is not going to be able to castle the king right away, because if you castle here after takes, white can sack the bishop, take this pawn, and suddenly you get brutally checkmated on the king side and you lose. So Magnus is not going to easily be able to complete his development, which means that the game does go on, and it does show how strong Arjun is, that he is not taking his foot off the gas. He's not getting worried even though he has lost a pawn on g2. We get rook f8 from Magnus, and here Arjun plays bishop d4. Now, after bishop to d4, we get the move queen to b7 here, and Arjun plays the move rook g3. Now, the computer here prefers this move queen to e3. I really don't understand why, because it doesn't stop black from pushing b4 at all, or going a5, b4. And frankly, from the human perspective, rook g3 looks much more natural. Maybe you try to guard on the third rank, stack the rooks. It's just a move that seems more natural to me. So here Magnus plays b4 anyway. Arjun takes, we get queen takes b4, and now we have the move bishop takes a6 being played. Now at this point, Magnus is really trying to attack on this a file here. The b and c files are open. The black king is very safe on e8. You'll notice the rook guards the pawn. All these pawns really support the king here. So because Magnus's king is very safe, Arjun probably feels like he's getting attacked, and he wants to try and level the material by taking this pawn on a6. Magnus goes rook to b8, and this is surprisingly a mistake here. Computer prefers rook to a8, bishop to e2, and now something like something like g takes h5 here, and I guess after takes it wants some queen a5, king c1, rook c8, which frankly to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I don't really understand what exactly is going on here, but the computer thinks black is better. I would also say this is not very human, as you can see from my reaction. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we got rook b8. Arjun plays bishop e2. We get to move rook to a8, and now we have the move b3 being played. Now, as I mentioned before, Magnus has made some slight mistakes here, hasn't played like the 3500 computer, but it's worth pointing out that Arjun is actually doing quite well because the rook guards the pawn on the third rank, but now you can also go for the classic fianchetto here with bishop b2, and the king can be safe. Now, the computer thinks that bishop b2 is a mistake. It wants king c1, but this move just makes much more sense from the human perspective as you try to guard the king. Here we get queen a2, king c1, and now Magnus plays the move rook c8, trying to attack on the c file. Arjun goes c4 here, and now we get the move g takes h5, and we have the move queen d4. Magnus goes h4, we get to move rook to h3, and here we have rook g8 being played. Now the problem for Arjun is that not only is Magnus up an extra pawn on the h file, but Arjun has to guard all these weaknesses. You can't do anything on the c file. You have to guard the pawn on b3. Black is trying to use the open g file, trying to use the active dark sword bishop as well, and it's just very, very difficult to defend this, especially when you're low on time in the situation. So here Arjun plays king c2. We get queen to a8, rook to c3, and now we have the move bishop e4. Now rook c3 is a big mistake at this point in the game. Frankly though, I think it's just very hard to defend. Computer wants rook a1, queen c6, and something like bishop d3 to stop the check on e4. But even here after rook g2 with ideas like bishop c5, I think that in a limited time situation like this game where it's rapid or blitz, there's just no shot to play the best moves from the white side, and I think you're going to lose most of the time. So after rook to c3, Magnus plays bishop e4, checking the king, and now we get to move bishop d3, and here we have bishop f3 attacking the rook on d1. Arjun plays rook a1, we get to move queen to c6, and now we have the move bishop takes h7 being played. Now you're probably wondering, why is the computer saying this is winning for black? The main reason is because Magnus is going to push his p up the h file, and when you combine that with the active rook that can go to g2 here, white is not able to attack this black king. Now another thing in Magnus's games that's been talked about a lot is one of the things that he prioritizes above and beyond anything else is king safety, and here Magnus's king is very, very safe here. The bishop is around the king, the queen is around, the pawns are around it. Because of all these pieces around the king, his king is safe, and he has his passed h pawn, he's pushing up the board, and the white king is not safe at all. So we get bishop h7. Magnus plays rook g2. Here we get bishop to a3, and now we get the trade, and here h3 is played. And now Magnus is making use of this outside h pawn, just pushing it up the board. The white king is loose. The rook targets the pawn at f2, and as you can tell from the valuation bar, the game has gone completely wrong for Arjun. Arjun plays queen h4. We get h2 here, trying to push the pawn up the board. Here, rook a1 is played, and now Magnus plays rook g1, simply offering the trade of the rooks here, or pushing the pawn to h1 and getting a second queen. Arjun takes the pawn on h2. Magnus takes the rook on a1. We get to move bishop to g6 here, trying desperately to create a nice fancy repetition here. If black were to take the free bishop, white can actually draw the game with check, check, check. And after king f7 check, it's the same thing here. If you go this way, same thing. I just keep checking forever. And if you ever go to h8, I can keep checking this way too. So with all these checks, the game would end in a draw. But of course, Magnus has no interest, and he plays a very cool and quiet move. King to d8 here, sliding the king to c7. The king gets to safety. There's no way to attack it after check king c7. Queen, pawn, and rook around it. Black has the extra rook on a1. And for that reason, after king to d8, Arjun Erigaisi resigns this game, and Magnus gets a 4th win in a row. He goes a perfect 3 for 3 on day 2 of the Kolkata Rapid and Blitz tournament in India. Just a fantastic day for Magnus, showing his class here. And all these games are a little bit different. The game against Wesley, a positional masterpiece in the end game. This game against Arjun, a very sharp tactical game, but Magnus understanding the king's safety with the pawn and the bishops around the king, even though the king was staying in the center for a long time, showing great understanding and prioritizing and valuing his king safety over everything else. A masterful game. The game against Narayanan, a little bit different, a little bit more positional, but playing on one open file in Spanish. So Magnus really showcasing his versatility and really dominating. And most importantly, I think Magnus is showing, especially as it relates to Arjun, that the boss is still around. It is not game over. Magnus is still a formidable opponent. He's not ready to hand over his crown just yet, and he remains the best player in the world. So a very exciting day 2 in the Kolkata Rapid and Blitz. Now, in spite of Magnus's perfect score, going 3 out of 3 and on a 4-game winning streak, he is still only a half point ahead of the Uzbeki talented junior Norbek Abdustorov, who has 4.5 points out of 6. Tomorrow they will play in day 3. If Norbek can beat Magnus, Norbek might win the Rapid event. If Magnus wins, of course he will win the event, but there's still a lot left to play for on the final day. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the second day of the Tata Steel Chess India Rapid and Blitz event being held in Kolkata, India. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with another recap after day 3 of the Rapid portion of this event tomorrow. Hope you guys enjoyed it and have a great rest of your day. See you guys soon. Bye.